Here we go. Part 4 of bellular coverage going into Final Fantasy.
We've got Candy Kit saying Shadow, I assume they mean Shadow Bringers. Raids pay off a lot more when you do level synced 50 ARR extreme trials. I don't know what that means.
Okay, so synced means doing things at that level, which you can do. So the raids that are in like A Realm Reborn or in in Heavensward in Stormblood, you can do those now. And class design is different, so it's not exactly intact, but the raid is intact. You'll be down at an appropriate difficulty level. It is kind of, imagine if time walking wasn't so janky.
Right.
That's what it feels like. To the point where there's the ultimate Bahamut fight, the Binding Coils of Bahamut, whichever the ultimate version of that is.
Yeah.
You actually straight up, like, that's not a thing you can do, like, synced, because it's really hard. It is nuts. So it's almost like, oh yeah, I've heard, you hear that say, I'm trying to think of a good fight. People say, oh, Battle of Desire Lore is one of the best raids in a long time. I wonder what Mythic Jaina feels like. And you can't experience that.
But in FF I could.
In FF you can go experience that. You would need to have the people, but you can just go do that. The rewards don't, like, you'll get like rewards from the time, so gear from the time for like appearances and stuff like that. But it is just, you can do it synced for the experience. It's not intact, but it is there.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump ahead of him and we'll come back. So scaling in the games works very different. World of Warcraft for a number of years didn't scale and things just died off. And so when they added scaling, it broke a lot of things because it wasn't designed with that in mind. They've added what's called world scaling. So the entire world is synced to your level, which means at all times, if you unlock a new skill on the bar, you have that ability forever and ever. If you have new gear on, you wear that gear until you replace it with better gear. There's no reason to go backward ever, ever, ever. Your character is always facing forward. What that means in party is that, let's say Brian and I wanted to run a dungeon. I'm level 35, he's level 45. Those are both appropriate for that dungeon because it's got a range on it. We run it. I see all monsters as level 35s. I hit them as if they're level 35 elites. I'm a level 35. The gear that drops is level 35. It's all for me. Brian is with me, and he is not being penalized. Everything is 45 for him. Now, the reason that breaks is because now the way you are determined in how powerful you are is what your eye level is relative to your level. And so if you don't regularly upgrade your gear or have an heirloom set that upgrades for you, you can get out of sync. And so leveling in current expansions feels a little bit janky because what happens is you start in, let's say, raid gear from the previous expansion, and compared to that level, you're incredibly well geared. And then you slowly move into these quest screens, and your gear is actually worse relative to your level. So you can actually fall off, and the world can get harder as you level before you get to end game, and it gets easier again because now your level is fixed and your eye level is rising. But what that also means is that old content tends to die because the scaling has caps so that we have a chance to run legacy content in that God mode and we one-shot things because we want that. And so if something has a maximum level of, let's say, level 20, it will sync with you. And then when you hit 21, it's going to stop syncing. And you hit 22, it's still at 20. 23, 20. 50, 20. And it just stays there. And so eventually you get incredibly powerful against it. This is how the scaling system works in World of Warcraft. Within a nutshell, I've skipped over some things, but Final Fantasy does things very differently. They use what's called level sync. You opt into this system. So it is tied to running instances within synced if you choose to run a synced roulette or something like that. Or for fates, you actually click a button that syncs you down, and you go back down to that level as it was. Now your gear syncs back to the top of what was in that available in that time, so it gets easy. Classes have been added to the game since then. Abilities have been changed kind of in how they work. So potencies are regularly off. So it is not a perfect representation of as it was, but your rotation gets simpler. If you sync down to level 10 content, and level 10 content is learning content where people have 2-button rotations, guess what you have? A 2-button rotation. So the content is more preserved. So if there's one legitimate level 10 in the group, they're with people who would only be able to do the utility that is appropriate for the time. And it helps preserve that. You opt into syncing into things. It is not something forced on you. and it doesn't really scale up. They've started exploring a new word called Unreal, where they kind of bring things the other direction. The current relic grind area, like the Maw, actually syncs everybody to the same, whether you're above or below level 430. It brings you there, so we're all in at the same. So they've messed with some things, kind of exploring what this means. But it is there, and it kind of does most closely resemble time walking for World of Warcraft terms, but it restricts your rotation. You don't necessarily have the same rotation from an expansion to expansions ago, so you may not even be learning how to do your class in a way that really applies in perfectly one-to-one with current content. Now, Ultimates, this is where I really disagreed with them and had to hit pause. Ultimates, on the other hand, are always synced. Always. And the reason for that is not because they're really, really hard. It's to preserve that they're really, really hard. Yes, synced, they are really, really hard, but his explanation kind of made me ask, well, if they're so hard, why don't you just let me run it unsynced? No. They are preserved. They are locked in time. And so imagine if some of the most iconic bosses of all time, imagine if you could go run Ulduar as a raid and you could only do it synced. There was no way to go back and beat Yogg-Saron without being synced. It would make mounts and cosmetics from that raid incredibly rare, incredibly valuable, because they would represent something you did, something you achieved. And so if there was loot locked behind the mythic version of a particular boss, let's say they only did it with the one-off bosses like Onyxia, and the only way to go beat Onyxia was to go beat Onyxia relatively legit. Keep in mind, synced is at the top. You are all best in slotted, give or take. There's some ways to manipulate that system, of course. Imagine how much more rare the loots and the titles and the achievements from that would be. And so we only have 3 of those fights ever. It is the hardest difficulty in the game when it is added, and their goal is to preserve that as much as is reasonable. It is not a perfect preservation, but the difference here in what they're talking about is the scaling system works different from the get-go. And so when we talk about certain content being preserved or not preserved, or can I run at minimum item level, or can I run it in a harder version than I am running it, the fact that scaling works so differently changes way more than just instance content. It changes the entire way you interact with the world.
But see, that just has me thinking, like, dude, if I could, like, kind of go do Desire Lore as it was, that'd be so incredible. But that actually doesn't work with WoW, because Desire Lore was designed around Heart of Azeroth and Azerite armor and all of that stuff, so it wouldn't really work with WoW. But in principle, you know, the idea of basically, from what I understand, it's not like mythic time walking, because time walking, your full character transports back in time and it's scaled, whereas in FF, like, you lose abilities. If you didn't you know, if it would send you actually back to a level 50 version of the character you're playing, which I guess is how they can have all of those fights still work.
Actually, in my opinion, it comes from the technical limitations of the fact that level sync is way older than world sync.
You know, it's a bit like how if you get a whole bunch of level 60s in World of Warcraft now and you send them to, you know, into Molten Core, they're going to absolutely cream it.
Well, here's one thing that's kind of weird about that, and it's like, some of it comes down to the design of classes. They've definitely changed, right? They're definitely massively different for some classes, and there's even whole mechanics that are gone now. Like the original TP mechanic, which was I can't remember what it actually stood for, but it was basically like you used it up for physical abilities, instead of you know, use mana for magic, use this for original stuff, and then
and so sprint costs that.
It was like it was basically used to limit certain abilities. So most abilities, melee classes would regen more TP than they use, unless you were spamming AoE, for example. So I played a warrior back when TP was still a thing, and going into a thing and pressing AoE ability, I couldn't spam it. I'd run out of TP. And that kind of sucked, but that's just gone now. So you can just spam it, and they've adjusted everything. So there's definitely been like big changes that are good, but it's like, it's completely... Oh yeah, and that's right, someone in the chat just said the sprint ability ate your entire TP bar. Now sprint is like a movement speed thing you can use in combat when you need.
It meant that DPS that had to move, that were physical, had a harder time than the fact that I was a black mage, because they were like, well, I don't want to use my TP on sprint.
and that used to be frustrating. But
So there's
yeah, so the point I was making there was that it's definitely different, but all of that stuff is still there, and people are saying Kwang Ma saying format on the topic of Ultimate Bahamut, which is the unending coil of Bahamut. The weapon you get from it and for transmog is unique, and the title is very
Okay.
prestigious, and that's because it's literally the hardest shit in the game. You can just go give it a try.
is Bahamut. What's that the boss of?
There's an optional raid, so not part of the MSQ. An optional raid in A Realm Reborn.
So I think what he's asking here is what's going on with the ultimates. So I'm not sure if Matt's going to get to it, but ultimates for WoW players, they're not about just scaling a savage fight up. They actually change the encounter entirely. So imagine if you got to the end of heroic or mythic Nathria, somewhere in that ballpark, and that's going to be our savage. We only have 4 fights, you got 10, but some are harder than others, and so what we would do for mythic is we would take generals and sludge fist and shove them into one marathon encounter, and so they really dial it just past the point of insanity. It's never designed to be something that the majority of players need to clear, have to clear, are capable of clearing. And it never gets easier, so you can take as long as you want to prog it. So a brand new set of players that only play 1 or 2 nights a week might take months to clear it. A set of expert players might be able to do it in under 50 hours, under 30 hours, whatever, of pulls, and they might be able to put that kind of time in over a series of weeks, not months. It's really going to depend on your experience. The strategies are, of course, very well documented, but that's not the issue. The issue is that it's very much like week 1 of some of these fights and raids where people question, how are we expected to clear this? Well, it's not tuned for you. It's tuned for those world first raiders, because the average raid group isn't going to get to the bosses in the back half of a raid tier in World of Warcraft for several weekly lockouts, and so their item level is going to be substantially higher than when the world first kill of that boss happened.
Is the Binding Coils of Bahamut,
Right.
which is this series of raids. And I haven't even done them. I really should, but I just keep forgetting, and they seem amazing. But also, yeah, because there's a storyline attached to A Realm Reborn raids, I can just go do them and it'll be fun.
Yeah.
But it's that's what that is.
There's another thing, Unreal Trials, that Nino just supered us about
Unreal
that as
Trials.
well.
So I actually have no idea how difficult they are,
Right.
but they are limited time available things. Because I think they're in Shadowbringers at least.
They're literally time walking. They're bringing a boss back. They're scaling it to current people so you can bring in your full set of skills and stuff. So they're brought up to you instead of you down to them. So it's literally time walking. The difference is that we swap out which thing is available, just like with time walking, how each set of time walking you have different dungeons available. So far, we're only a couple bosses into the system. Ideally, they've said that they would like to bring some bosses back. So I'm hoping at some point we're getting 2 bosses at a time, or we're getting them more rapid fire than once per patch cycle.
They're old fights, but designed anew and harder. So you've got your
They're not meant to be harder, just respectful of current content. And so if a fight had something that messed with the way healers dealt with mana, like Leviathan, that's my understanding of how old Leviathan Extreme worked, is you would I didn't do it back then, definitely not as a healer, and so I did Leviathan normal but not Extreme. So what they may have to do is, right, so if abilities function differently, they may have to make tweaks to the fight to make them possible, to make them not punish you unnecessarily for abilities that have been pruned, or and take advantage of people. So they've been tuned, but their goal, my understanding from listening to the devs, the goal is not for them to be harder than they were. I think they're just meant to be respectful of how they were. And so when a mechanic kills you and you've been running that synced in the equivalent of best in slot, and now you're not best in slot, then something that you might survive 2 or 3 hits of standing in something you're not supposed to, you might not do that in an Unreal.
trials, which are like I was talking about, the raid bosses that are single boss part of the MSQ. That's what a trial is. I think there's some that are optional as well. Honestly, I don't completely get the distinction between trials and raids. Outside of trials seem generally easier.
Right.
But the Unreal ones are extremely, extremely difficult. So they're Unreal.
It's hard to compare difficulty because the goal is to take them back to extreme as they were, but we are sitting in an expansion right now where Leviathan Unreal came out at the same time as Diamond Extreme, and Diamond Extreme compared to recent extremes of recent history, has been largely considered very, very easy. And so even if Leviathan is truly exactly on par with where it was, it's going to feel hard compared to Diamond. Diamond was my really kind of first attempt. I've done extreme attempts in the past, but it was part of a night where I was going to be going into Savage for the first time. And having never seen the inside of the instance of Diamond outside of videos, my first pull, as they let me be main tank, our first pull we got it to 16%, and the second pull we downed it. And so when Leviathan isn't that forgiving, because it wasn't because I didn't make mistakes that affected the party. I got people killed, we just picked them back up, and it was fine. Leviathan's not going to be so generous about that.
Trials are the ARR's extreme, scaled up to 80. Which is current content.
Okay.
Which is different from going back and doing the extreme synced. But it's like, it's just...
This is where I struggle, because it's like...
So there's two terms that are thrown around. I know I'm hitting on this a lot. So there's synced, and there's what's called minimum item level. Synced takes you to basically best in slot of the time. Minimum item level is the minimum level that they believe this content was clearable. There's nothing in between. And so if you can imagine the difference, WoW players, between fighting a boss on best in slot of the time, everybody in your raid group, or you can imagine going back to week 1, watching guilds like Limit and Method and Echo try to clear this. Those are two very, very, very different encounters. And so when we throw these things around, saying something is between them is because we don't have a word between that. And when you say minimum item level, it implies an extreme level of difficulty to the point where people go, oh, then maybe I don't want to do that. But when you say synced, people are like, oh, well, I'll just go hop in blind and get my clear. Maybe not.
Like there's so much
so
like
terms.
domain specific knowledge.
Yeah, there's so many terms, but it's like, as far as I understand, extreme trials are essentially slightly easier than Savage raids, which are difficult raids, which are
like heroics.
It's meant to be our heroic. It's meant to be the half step between normal.
No, beyond that.
Okay.
Probably. I don't know how they compare to Mythic rating in WoW, because they're like 8 people, and the entire difficulty is different. And here's actually one of the things. Okay, it's synced upwards, right? So, yeah, if people say Unreal is what time walking would be conceptually.
Okay.
But my point I was making was more about how I was talking about all the TP stuff, but it's so normally you do a time walking dungeon.
Yeah.
And some things don't work because you just have a completely different toolkit for how fights work. The vast majority of fights in FF don't give a shit about what buttons you're pressing, outside of healing, damage reduction, and your DPS. So it's not like you're doing a load of CC at the right times. There's some fights where I think you can use like slowing CCs and stuff in their help.
So when I watch the World First races back to back at the same time or whatever, one of the key differences is in World of Warcraft, you can have 25 players, right? So you've got this whole host of players. We have 24-man content in Final Fantasy, but it doesn't scale up. It's just normal difficulty. That means, to make that interesting, it is not uncommon to have something where you have a different tank pulling things off to the side. You have these movement. You split the party into 3 groups. You have people dropping into different realms. There are all these mechanics besides just hit the boss and don't stand in things. And so there's more complexity because that's how you challenge a large coordinated group, as opposed to Final Fantasy where everything is 8-man, which is even more individual responsibility than the 10-man minimum recommended size of a party in World of Warcraft. That's the small group rating. And so 8-man is meant, it puts a lot of pressure on the individual person. So there's already pressure to not die, to not stand in things, to be where you need to be. There are mechanics that stack and spread. Arenas are typically, as a result, much smaller. And so there is a lot of tight moving space. It's about space management tightly, not about like us orienting our way around a big room or something like that, depending on the fight. We only get 4 fights per tier versus WoW's 10. So it's hard to compare exact difficulties because across all of Nathria, there were some bosses that just fell over. There were other bosses that people thought might be impossible. And so it can really vary. There's only 4. So it's just hard to directly compare. But the bigger differences as you kind of scale up are how that individual player responsibility grips in. And so what Final Fantasy tends to feel like, to me, compared to World of Warcraft, is fights are substantially more scripted. You're in a smaller arena for less people. And so because they're scripted and the game doesn't allow DBM, what it ends up feeling like is you're kind of playing an advanced version of Dance Dance Revolution, where you need to be in certain spots at certain times. There are set strategies. They will work every single time once you perfect them. But you're doing that while weaving your rotation, which is standard abilities every 2.5 seconds with off the global cooldowns, utility spells added. And so you're playing basically Guitar Hero with your rotation. There are skill priorities depending on the class. Some classes have more variation in their rotation. Some are very, very cyclical. And so you're playing Guitar Hero while doing Dance Dance Revolution, which means when you're learning a fight, you're not very good at the guitar part. And so your DPS struggles, so you fail DPS checks, and there's all sorts of mechanics to wipe you. But as you get better, your DPS, of course, spikes, and people get to where they can clear this stuff relatively cleanly, first, second, third pull, every single week. There's only 4 fights. If you're doing 3 pulls per fight, you can just blast through them. E12 tends to mess up some groups, but like I do see clean pulls of it. As we move into World of Warcraft, there's 10 fights. It's much more of a marathon. It's totally different just because of quantity. So we try to compare these because these games are more similar to each other than any other game compares to either one of them. But sometimes the comparisons still fall short.
Helpful, but they are very rare. Most of it is literally just character movement.
Okay.
Your character movement in a group, and sometimes when you press an extra button. That's how fights are designed. And it's such a different toolkit than World of Warcraft.
Keep in mind with the toolkit that World of Warcraft players are expected to have deadly boss mods, a DBM, or somebody raid calling out mechanics for them. World First races literally have coaches. They are calling out mechanics. And so the devs have to develop knowing that they are playing with all of that information, which means they have to make things that are way more opaque. And so it's not always clear why you died. It's not always clear what a mechanic is doing or telling you to do, because they have to hide it from you, because players have way more advanced tools to help them diagnose this stuff and get it right with systems like weak auras and all of that, where Final Fantasy doesn't encourage all of that. And so you just end up with a different level of information in the player's hands. And so you end up with encounters that just feel different.
Warcraft tends to use. It's similar, but for like dungeons and stuff, it's just completely. Oh man, it's completely nuts. Honestly,
That's
completely
neat. Epic basic sword.
Yeah.
Epic basic sword. Yeah, says they even made the Duty Finder part of the lore, which is just amazing.
Oh, that's
neat.
That was. I don't think they did that before Shadowbringers, but when there's a moment in that where it does kind of become part of.
It is. You're supposed to be running with other adventurers. You're the Warrior of Light. Ethos addressed that when I asked him in a thing. It is addressed, but Shadowbringers, we address it much more straight on, much more head on. Keep in mind, the reason that roulette exists the way it does within Final Fantasy is that dungeons are tied to the main story. And because the main story is required, much like Shadowlands campaign quest is required, but that's for every single expansion, new players would be gated when they got to Wailing Caverns and couldn't find a group. When they got to Strathholm and couldn't find a group, they would be stuck. And so what we've done is we've created systems in the game that encourage end-game players to sink down and do that content at least once per day and run that old stuff. It adds to the library. You've got to keep in mind both of these games between let's say kind of like heroic content down to normal have roughly 130 plus instances before you include true raids. That's just trials and dungeons for Final Fantasy, and that's just 5-man dungeons for World of Warcraft, and many of those have multiple bosses. So we have lots of content, and because Final Fantasy forces new players to try the vast majority of all of that once, it encourages them to create a system where old players go back in a much less optional system than Time Walking, where they literally have weekly loot that helps you gear up, that one of the sources of that, if you so choose, is to go back and sink down and help those new players through content. So it just creates a different relationship as opposed to in World of Warcraft. I don't have to help a new player. They can catch up with us without me. Yeah, it's going to suck a little more, but they can get there.
The lore. It doesn't completely make sense, but there's a little bit of it does in a way that they haven't. They'll probably do it further in Endwalker, but they do it properly, and I'm just like, Jesus Christ. That was one of the most exciting moments I've ever seen in a video game.
Wow.
And it's literally like there's one character casts a spell that they've cast before, and just the very fact that they've done this and how they say how they do the incantation, I was just like, fight.
So they're reaping what they've sowed.
Yep.
It seems like in so many cases it's just more than sum of parts equals big win. You go.
That's basically the entirety of it. Like,
yeah,
it's
like
completely insane.
Is that why, say, Levi Nussman here was able to super us, saying the best way I can describe the difference is WoW content lately feels like something to do, FF14 feels like some place to be. Is that just like is a comment like that just more like a manifestation of broad sentiment, your character feeling more personal, and then I guess having more RPG-ish things? Like, I've just noticed, like, the dress-up side of this game is really big. Like, the glam community, you've got your free company housing, the way that crafting and stuff like that works seems to be just the community's more important. Yeah, I just wonder if, it's those things have came together very successfully for this game.
I actually think that Final Fantasy players regularly accuse the game of not being an MMO, of being something you can enjoy alone, of being something that people who are familiar with the Final Fantasy franchise and don't want to come into 14 because it's in an MMO will say, hey, if you don't want to engage with multiplayer outside of running a handful of instances once, you really don't have to, and in the current expansion you can run them with NPCs. So like they really have made it where you have to interact with players only as much as you want to, and then the community is formed out of a desire to form, out of a passion to form. And so when you're in a community, you're there because you want to be. World of Warcraft had this community early on that kind of formed, and they leaned into that. And so now you need those other players. You need them. And people have created add-ons to help you group up for world quests and things like that, and hop in anonymously with these people and hop out without ever speaking a word. And you're forced into these interactions. And so you need your mythic clear. Your friends aren't on. You have to run it with strangers. And the strangers are way better than you and you're frustrating them, or they're way worse than you and they're frustrating you. And so there's this drastic disconnect in expectations and reality among the group, and so there's all of this animosity that can form. And so this community goes and creates tools which of course rate players and hold them to a number based on their best ever performance, and now you have to be playing at your best level ever or you're total trash. And then World of Warcraft is like, hey, that's a really cool idea that you made that made this thing really toxic, but people do it because it's the only way that makes it possible. What if we bake that in native with a system called Dungeon Score? That's a really good idea. And so this community is forced in World of Warcraft, and even when you don't want to be there, depending on the type of content you want to run, you can feel incredibly forced into proximity with people you don't want to be near. And so you resent them like you do people in line with you at the DMV, as opposed to something like people who are going to a concert to see a band you also want to see. Wow, I had no idea all these other people also liked that band. That's so cool. Yes, it's frustrating there's lines for the bathroom. Yes, it's frustrating there's lines for food, but I'm excited to be in a place of like-minded individuals that I chose to be. I had the ability to enjoy this music at home by myself. And so I think a lot of it comes down to, is the community something you have to engage with in World of Warcraft, where the world and the community is the content, or is something like Final Fantasy where the core content is something you can enjoy entirely at your own pace, and then everything else is additional. Please deepen and expand. Please watch the behind the scenes stuff after the movie. Come engage with the community once you're done with all that. You say you don't want to now, it's going to be really awesome, and afterwards you might want to come talk about it. We'll be here. And so I think it's just a difference in why you are interacting with other players that decides if, even though I might run into the same stranger in both games and not know it's them, our interactions with each other in WoW have a higher chance of making one of us go, of course, than in Final Fantasy. I don't think it's that one set of players is more toxic as human beings. I think the game just makes it really, really easy to expose any frustration that's there, as opposed to Final Fantasy makes it really, really easy to hide it. It's literally bannable to be toxic in game, and so they kind of just push it down, and it changes the texture and the tone of the game.
Generally, yes. Generally, everything they do on that front is miles ahead of what other similar games do, outside of maybe in some weird sense OSRS maybe. But it's like the idea of all of your crafted stuff for housing, how crafted gear even fits into endgame catch up sometimes, and then let's not even talk about how crafting is its own entire own game as is gathering. It's like sometimes it seems to put more work into designing crafters and gatherers than actual jobs, which is
Wow.
interesting. But it's just people are saying glamour is the true endgame. It absolutely is. Like, absolutely is.
Good, it's fun.
Yeah, but then it's the idea of like that. It's almost like the Algalon achievement for killing that at the right thing.
It's the true in-game the same way transmog and mounts are the true in-game in WoW. It's the true in-game if you make it the true in-game. I don't like that cosmetics is the true in-game theme that pops up in games where veteran players run out of other stuff to do and they dive deep into the cosmetic system and they love it. The cosmetic system is an invitation to go run content you've never run to get access to those cosmetics. It's an invitation to spend time staring at your character while you're waiting for a group to form. And maybe it becomes a primary source of content for you, or maybe it doesn't. Once I glamour my characters, they stay that glamour forever. My warrior is iconically known as a blue pig. Since I have this blue goofy pig suit, it's just a silly like mascot style suit. It looks nothing like the vast majority of cosmetics in the game, and I just think it's funny to see it in cutscenes, and so I love it. I've done all of my guides for various trials as my warrior, which means they've all been in this blue pig. And so when people come into my stream and they see me playing other classes, they're like, I thought you were a blue pig. That's just my warrior. It's just something goofy that I make my main do because it helps make cutscenes that I've seen before something that's more entertaining. And I've never changed it. I don't change it. I get a new weapon glam, and I just change it back to the old one. I don't mess with it. It is the true in-game if you make it the true in-game. I don't like when any MMO sits there and is like, cosmetics is the true in-game, because while they may feel they're doing somebody a favor, what they don't know is the audience. And if they're talking to somebody who doesn't like just doing things cosmetically, somebody like my brother, where I'm aiming to improve. So I either want to move up a leaderboard, or I want to see personal improvement. I want to grow as a gamer. I want to grow within this game. I want my power to increase. And those are his end game. Cosmetics don't do much. Making the level go higher but doesn't do anything doesn't do much. Mounts, all of that, those are all very, very optional to him. He wants things like PvP. He wants things like a chance to compete with other players to get the best loot, to go into content that is meant to punish his face. That's the goal. And so saying that to him can accidentally scare him off from a game that does have other things. Cosmetic being the true in-game implies that it's the only in-game, and it's not. It is a end game. The cosmetic system is massive in this game. But if you don't want to do it, that's fine.
Thing at the right item level. I can't remember what the title was. But that's what people are saying like ultimate stuff is. It is just this is stuff that you can't cheese.
I like that. Yeah.
You go do that, and it doesn't matter if you were playing an ARR and got it, or if you managed to get a group together, last week. Absolutely remarkable stuff. Remarkable stuff.
From Shooter Shooter, yes, we said, imagine an ultimate fight in WoW where we fight Lich King plus Sindragosa and the Blood Queen in an alternate version where Tyrion stayed frozen and Frostmourne didn't break. This is an ultimate. Damn. That seems pretty big.
I'm really, really
But we've only gotten 3 of them ever. The 4th one is supposed to be out right now, and it's not.
looking forward. I'm really looking forward into actually doing that in a huge way. I don't know when I'll be able to get Ultimate on the go, but I definitely do want to try it at some time.
There's another superhero from Sailness, Nightfeather.
Yeah.
Sailness? I'm so... Right, here's the thing. When you are dyslexic as fuck and you actually look at words, it's very hard to pronounce them phonetically sometimes, so sorry. Nightfeather. Let expense contract Ian become instant champions from beyond the rift. Heed my call.
Yep.
Apparently that is the line spoken when the duty finder is made canon.
That's it. Let expanse contract Aeon become
That's
instant.
fun.
It's class. It's class.
I'm excited. I'm excited for him going through this journey. I think translation seems to be one of the things that he's wanting to get ahead of, and that's a very natural thing. It's why a lot of my translation videos, like what are the cosmetic terms in these, what are the differences between these systems, both here on Gaming Kinda and on Work to Game, are videos that head in the comments are like, thank you, this is all I needed, because those exist. And while there are players that play both games, there are vocal minorities in both games that will mock you for playing the other game. And so in World of Warcraft, they'll call you names for playing Final Fantasy, and in Final Fantasy they'll say that, you know, you're a toxic player, or you don't belong, or you play a crap game if you also play World of Warcraft, or aren't you so glad you're not in that crap game right now. And so that vocal minority exists in both places, and so people tend to just not mention it. They tend to I just play games, man. I'm just here to play 14. And so a huge number of players have played both and know this translation, but it means the information, because the ability to jump back and forth is not rejoiced. And so because of that, I think there's a lot of need for just this translation. And so if you have a friend that is going either direction, wants to come try World of Warcraft or World of Warcraft Classic with you, or wants to come try Final Fantasy with you, it doesn't matter if they're coming from the other one of these games or from any other game. A lot of times all they need is some simple translation. All they need to know is that their knowledge from before has value. All they need to know is that it's not going to be as hard as your first ever MMO. It's not going to be as overwhelming, because you're going to go to do something and you're going to go, hey, I want to do concept A, and then I was hoping to work towards concept B, and you're like, very cool. These are the words you're looking for. This is what's different about those, because while they are 80% the same, that last little bit, it's going to work a little bit differently. And it does that because none of these systems is an island. They all interact somewhat with surrounding systems, so they can't be carbon copies. Even if one system is something that the devs from that game loved, they're still going to have to change it to make it fit if they want to be respectful of their own game and their own community. And so it's just something that helps them understand as they jump from game to game that all of that information is useful because they have experience in gaming, kinda.